Hello and welcome everyone to the 16th presentation in the virtual history series presented by Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. I'm Margaret Stella, Programs Research and Publications Manager for AIA Baltimore and the BAF. Thank you to everyone who donated to be with us this week. Support is the reason why we're able to continue this each week. And I want to make sure we announce next week's virtual histories. It will be Society's Cage, an interpretive design pavilion for the Black Lives Matter movement. Designers Dayton Schroeder and Chris Wood from the architecture firm Smith Group will present this timely interpretive installation currently on view at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. from August 28th through September 6th. The bold public pavilion is sculpted to symbolize the historic forces of systemic racism. The experience educates visitors and functions as a sanctuary to reflect, record, and share personal thoughts, and to build empathy and healing. We hope to bring this installation to Baltimore. Please join us to learn more and how you can support this important design project. And now for today's presentation, Jillian Storms, AIA, is an architect and capital programs manager at the School Facilities Branch of the Maryland State Department of Education. She's the former president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and a current co-chair of the foundation's committee of the Dead Architects Society. Jillian led the Early Women of Architecture project, culminating in a traveling exhibition featuring 12 women practicing architecture from the 1920s to the 1960s. Jillian continues to work with the BAF to bring more stories of women architects to light and to document their projects. Please add any questions you have for her into the chat box or the Zoom chat box, and we'll try to catch as many of them at the end. And with that, Jillian, please share your screen.
Okay. I think it's shared. Good. Yes, so this is a talk I'm going to give. I've done several talks already on the early women of architecture in Maryland because it's a traveling exhibit that's been actually traveling since about 5 years now. So each time though I give a talk, I always learn something new as I take a moment to do further research. And the actual work on the exhibit that this talk is based on was done by a whole host of women who were part of the AIA Women in Architecture Committee that's now called the Equity Committee. And we had students from Maryland, from Morgan State University also helping. So it was a real collaborative effort, and it inspired us all to learn about these women many who started their firms in the Depression and how they managed with daycare at a time when that wasn't, as prevalent as it is now. So if you are interested in the exhibit, I did want to point out that it's currently on exhibit at the Liriodendron in Bel Air, Maryland, and there'll be an address at the end of this talk that you can see. And it's going to be there till September 30th. So today's talk is going to focus on 4 women in particular. I'm just calling them the Fab Four. Gertrude Sawyer, who was a woman architect who practiced, actually one of the older ones in our exhibit. She has a day in Maryland proclaimed after her. And then there's Catherine Cutler Ficken, who was the first female architect registered in Maryland. Gertrude was actually the second. And Helen Ross Staley, who was the first female architect of the AIA Baltimore chapter. And then last is Martha Cassell Thompson, who was the first known female African-American architect working on projects in Maryland. We did not, at that time when we did the exhibit, we didn't actually know of her. We learned later of her through Dale Green's research, and so I'm including her in this talk. So there's a lot of data here. I just want to point out some kind of really interesting things, dates of interest. The first woman to earn a Bachelor's of Science degree in architecture in the US was in 1979, University of Illinois, Marie Louisa Page. And this was a big deal because a lot of schools of architecture did not accept women. But a lot of the state colleges had to. So in 1981, we have our first professional woman architect who opens her partnership and also becomes the first woman architect of the AIA in 1888, which again is a big deal because to become a member of the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, at that time you had to have the blessing of several other people, and it was hard to get that blessing when there were a lot of people who didn't really think women should be practicing architecture. And she was elevated to the highest honor in the AIA, which is fellow, in 1889. So she obtained that stature. There was a design competition, the first one offered to women architects in 1891. And I want to point out this image here on the left is of the women's building at the World Columbia Exposition in Chicago. And it's interesting, our first woman architect refused to compete because men were paid $10,000 while women were only paid $1,000. So, but here's the winning design by Sophia Hayden. 1915 was actually the first school, Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture for women. There was no other school like this in the United States. And in fact, 3 of the women that are in the exhibit we have that tells the story of down here, these 12 women, that they, it was just very unusual. And it was actually started by a professor at Harvard. Harvard did not allow women to join the architecture studios. And so he was asked by a wealthy family that their daughter was really interested in architecture and wouldn't he teach her on the side? And before he knew it, when people heard that he was teaching, you know, women on the side, they started saying, well, could I come? And so it grew, and it eventually became associated with Smith College. It closed right the day after Pearl Harbor. It was sort of like the end of, certainly after that point, also Harvard opened its doors to women because a lot of the men were going off to war. So in 1934, National Association of Women forms. Catherine, who's in our exhibit, 1936, she becomes a licensed architect in Maryland. I want to point out that 1936 is the first year that we had registration in Maryland. We were sort of late to the game. DC had it in the 1920s. So she got right on it, and likely because her father was an architect and probably knew about this in the works. So we have the first female president of the AIA Baltimore in 1983. We have some other interesting dates here. I just want to point out that the field itself, now it's about 50% or more women are graduating from architecture schools. But the problem is there still is a lot of attrition in the field. Only 20% of the total licensed architect, and now this is architects, and this is in 2017, are female. But being those becoming registered, there's now 2 and 5. So eventually, there's a graph that shows female and male, how it's slowly the women are gaining ground in this profession. And then it was very interesting. I have a woman I was studying who was from Turkey, and her son also went to the University of Maryland. And he told me, he's now practicing in Turkey, and he said that the field in Turkey is becoming so, you know, a lot of women have gone into it that he says it's almost now considered a woman's profession. So what do you know about that? One of the things that surprised me when we did this exhibit and research is when we started looking for where all their projects were. If you look at this map, this is of Maryland, and this is where all the projects we've been able to identify that the 12 women that were in the exhibit had work. So it was really quite far afield. And I've seen many of these. I've gone and visited and documented them, and we're hoping to be able to document them for more fully if we are able to get a grant that we're going for right now. So the first woman I wanted to talk about was Gertrude. And I'm doing her first just because she was one of the older in the exhibit, and just sort of gives you a sense of how hard it was to start out. I mean, she was from Kansas, And, you know, her family was a farm family, but she always had an interest in construction and building and design. And, you know, her father wasn't, you know, supportive of it at first. And she attends University of Illinois in 1914, but she's not allowed at that time to go into the architecture school. So she went and got a degree in landscape architecture. And then she hears about the Cambridge School opening up in Massachusetts. And so she goes there to get trained and ends up heading back to Missouri after she graduates. And her father said that, you know, he would only, you know, support her in a further endeavor with this if she could actually build a house and have it sell. And indeed, she was managed to do that. And so he gave his blessing when she was able to find work in DC through a friend, Rose Greeley, who was another graduate of the Cambridge School of Architecture and also practiced in Maryland and DC. And so she went and moved into DC. And she was always actually a Washington, DC architect in the sense that she had her office there and her home, but she did work all over Maryland. This is one example of Cremona Farm in 1930. And fairly simple thing, but she's heavily detailed. She was very, very careful about detailing. One of her biggest breaks was in 1932. Now, mind you, she's still working for the firm of the DC firm, Horace Peasley, who she was with, and he was an excellent architect in himself. She gets this contract because somebody, the Jefferson Patterson, he wanted to have a state to show off his cattle, and it's in Calvert County, and this is this huge piece of land, Point Farm it's called. And she ended up being his chief architect and designed over 24 structures there. And this is her at the farm in her work clothes, as it would be, supervising the construction of one of these buildings. I wanted to share what she said in the Sunday Star in 1956. People who don't want a woman architect just don't come to you, but others see the advantage of your being able to interpret their individual needs because you are a woman. And so I would say definitely for Gertrude, she was so good at what she did, and that she was just highly recommended. So unlike some of the other women who first got their start, who maybe had a lot of wealthy connections, Gertrude really made it on her skills alone. And I just wanted to show some of the things from this farm. I mean, she designed the whole farmstead with all the cattle barns and all the service buildings. Here's some of her drawings. These are all the listing that the Maryland Historic Trust has of these buildings at the Jefferson Patterson estate. It was given to the state in order to build, well, it ended up being the site of the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory in 1998, designed by Ayres St. Gross. And at that time, the requirement was if they were going to build this, they would have to actually get Gertrude's approval. And by that time, she had retired to California. So Adam Gross actually, they sent out the drawings and he flew out and met with her. And at this point, she's 99 years old. And she reviewed the whole set and she kind of called him on it. And she was like, you know, what's that? And he's like, well, you know, that's a louver like what you have on your barn. And she says, mine work. So she knew that his didn't by reviewing the drawings, and she expected that of anything that was going to be on the location of all these. You know, she never got to do as big as she wanted to do. She actually had a thesis, and her school was on town planning. This is as close to town planning as she had with all the structures on this campus. But Governor Schaefer declared October 14th, 1994, Gertrude Sawyer Day in Maryland. And I think it was a big deal at the time when the laboratory was built. The next person I'd like to talk about is Catherine Cutler Ficken, who was the first woman to become an architect in Maryland. And like I said, her father, who's pictured here, was a prominent designer. They lived in Silver Spring, and they did work all around DC and in the metropolitan area. She's pictured here in the newspaper, Dad Displeased Once, Proud of Girl Now. This is 1935. So he was displeased, according to the newspaper article, because when she was a kid, she used to play with all his tools. And now he's appreciating it because she is helping him. This is the 30s. So, after, things crashed, he ended up doing a lot of work with public schools all through Montgomery County. And so she helped with this one in particular. That was what was in the article. She also did a lot of work. They did a lot of work at the University of Maryland. How much work she did on these, I do not know, except that the renderings are her. So here's of the Ritchie Coliseum in 1932, the George Washington University. Also, she did buildings there. And she did this huge aerial, and I have correspondence between her and University of Maryland about how much they really want to pay her, and they didn't understand why it took a huge room to do, because she had to stand back far enough to get the perspective she needed. But the reason I even know anything about Catherine is because she left a book of all these images, all her drawings and things with her son. And she didn't have everything labeled, so I actually had to hunt down and find what some of these were. But one of the things that she had in this album was a letter. And I want to read this to you because I find quite poetic. So this is being written by the president of the Maryland Society of Registered Architects, and that's Lucien Gradeau. And he's writing to her in 1938. And he says, I have your letter in regards to the dinner and annual meeting of the Maryland Society of Registered Architects. It goes without saying that you are currently eligible to attend the dinner in so much as you are a member of the society. You have the distinction of being the only lady architect in the society, and it must be left to your own discretion whether you wish to be the only lady in an entire gathering of men. I have to remember, she actually wasn't married at this point, so maybe it was a little bit touchy. But he ends up saying, you sort of put me on the spot in seeking advice. I will, however, do what architects frequently do and straddle the fence and say that whatever you decide to do on the advice and judgment of your good father would be agreeable to us. So here, 1938, she's asked to check in with her dad about coming to a major event of all architects. And we see here is a building that she did in Solomon's Island with her name on it. It's for the University of Maryland. So, it just shows you still need to get your father's blessing on these things. And these are some of the projects she worked on. This was another drawing that was in her portfolio, and I was able to identify it as the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission in Hyattsville in 1939. Here's what was Linwood Elementary in Montgomery County, and you can see her name is on the actual drawings. It's just a cute little, school building. They were very modest. This was the Depression, after all. And here is Rock Creek Recreation Center. So we have some information, but other information was really a peck and find. There were images of the Clara Hyatt residence in her album. And, I was like, wow, where is this thing? It doesn't exist today. Well, I was able to track it down. Here it exists, this little tiny building among all suburbia, nearly swallowing it. Basically, Clara Hyatt owned a farm, and she was a widow, and she wanted to be able to manage it. And it was during the war years, and she needed to manage it without men. And so she hired Catherine. She wanted a woman architect, and Catherine built everything, the barns, all that. Designed everything, and made it so that it had a unique irrigation system and such, so that she was able to do it with not as much help as she might have needed to. But I wanted to show you, this is what it looks like today. That's what it looked like in the album. And I was able eventually to put the two together when I found this. The owners used to have a website that they talked about their little castle. And And this, I got to have a tour, and these are images from inside, and this is what the stair that actually is inside the silo. Some of the detailing. She also did the University Dining Hall. And again, there's correspondence back and forth, always this fight to get paid. These were hard years, and it was interesting. They felt she was being too, they were acting like in their correspondence, the internal dialogue going in with the university was that she's just, like if it was her father, he would have known not to make a deal out of it. But she was like trying to put her foot down. I need my payment, you know. And apparently it grew in size, and it wasn't what her original contract was for. And so she was having to fight for every bit. This is now torn down. It's a restaurant that's in DC. But she did win an award for it because she basically took this Victorian restaurant and made and modernized it, and stainless steel, and it was all very new at the time. She has an interesting turn to her story. Her father ends up getting cancer and dies at 65. And soon after, I mean, she marries after he was, I think what happened is there became awareness. My dad and my sort of support structure is going, and I need to get on with my life because she still wasn't married. So she married her sweetheart in 1947, and they tried to have a child, and it didn't work for her. And we've been able to piece the story together with her adopted son. So she adopts her son 4 months old when she's 45 years old, but then she passes, only about 10 years later. So I mean, he didn't really know his mom very well, but she did leave him this big portfolio. The way I found him, though, is really interesting, and I'll just be quick on this because it's one of these fortuitous things. There wasn't anything that told me that she had a kid. I had to basically look in the obituary of hers, nothing. Her husband's nothing. It was her husband's second wife. When she died, she was a big church lady, and there were lots of people who came. And Aruda Finken Jr. and his wife Jill came from New Bern, North Carolina. And it was like, I don't know who this is. And so I ended up just doing a white page search, couldn't find a Finken, but I did find a Jill. And I cold called her, and she was her daughter-in-law. And so he's been up several times, and he actually gave me a drawing that she did. And I was able to track down and see that the house still exists in Silver Spring. So it's just really cool when these little things happen, because otherwise the story slips away. These things aren't, you realize how fragile history can be. Now with Helen Ross Staley, if you remember right, she's the first woman architect at the AIA Baltimore. Here she is with all grouping of men, and the only person who's a female is the administration, so the secretary of the organization. But she had a couple of her residential projects in the AIA Journal. She was featured in the newspaper at the time. So this would have been 1955 when she got registered. And she ended up not staying. When she got her registration, she left town. And we know that. We know why she left town. She said because it was blue blood, and it just, she worked for people, but she had to start out on her own. And we know that because she still lives. She lives in North Carolina, and I don't even know if she's on this call. I gave her word of it at the last minute that I was talking about this, but she did a wonderful project in Herondale. Here's this church she designed, and it's incredible structure that she built over time. And so she got a lot of notoriety at the time because there just wasn't as many women architects. And so here she is. So when we opened the exhibit in Annapolis in 2015, here she is, and here is Shirley Kennard, who also was in the exhibit. She was the last woman we had in our exhibit. Shirley has since passed, and this is Poldy Hirsch's husband. Poldy had died earlier, who she was another architect who practiced up in Harbor de Grace. But this was the first time they all met, and this is Helen's family. So we are just very fortunate. She's 99 years old, and she just contacted me again and wants to, what I really need is a team of people to help interview all these lovely ladies that still exist, because there are women who we weren't able to put in the exhibit that we learned about later. One of them is Martha Thompson. She was the daughter of Albert Cassell. And Albert Cassell was a prominent African-American architect in Washington, D.C. And he was graduate of Cornell. And his whole family, his two daughters and his son, all went into architecture school and all graduated from Cornell. So it's quite impressive, quite a lineage. And so that was in 1947 that she graduates, and she works in her father's firm basically from 1947 to 51. And there were numerous projects, including for Morgan State, that she worked on. So, so I believe she's probably the first one we know of who had Maryland work. And she passed away at age 43, unfortunately, but she worked on the rose windows of this project in DC, the Washington National Cathedral. And her daughter went on to graduate from the Illinois Institute of Technology and had apprenticed with Mies van der Rohe. So it is a family legacy. They deserve their own book. So that's it. How am I doing on time? Did I speed too fast? I think we have a few minutes for questions. Before I take questions, let me just put this slide up so you see this is the address of where it is now. And at the time that we had this, it was only through August, but now it's through, the exhibit is showing through September, and they're open on Wednesdays and I think the second Sunday. So here's the email, the website. So do check it out. We also have the research for the exhibit that you can find at AIAWAM.com. And I think they're going to put these in the chat box for you. And anyway, so yeah, I'll take questions.
And I did put the link for the early women of architecture in Maryland in the chat box. And so far, we don't have any questions. Just the only comment is, this is so wonderful. Seeing the exhibit in person is also such a treat. Thank you for this great research.
Yeah, well, we have, I mean, there was so many wonderful women who helped me put this all together. I had this idea back in 2014 because the National Building Museum always had these great things in March with women and architecture. And I said, why can't we do this in Baltimore? And so we ended up doing a deep dive and got a grant from the Maryland Humanities, and we didn't think we'd get it. And when we found out we got it, we suddenly had to do an exhibit. And so then there was, we had to find images, and I had to travel about to get the images. And so it was a labor of love, really. So this is just to say, if you want to see anything more, I mean, there's the exhibit shares 12 women's stories. So if you're really all curious, head up to the mansion, and it's pretty fantastical. I'm always just amazed we were able to pull it off.
Bill, we do have a question. As a non-architect, do you see any similarities in the work of early women architects that maybe is not what men were designing?
Okay. Yeah, no, I think there were a number of women in the exhibit that I learned about who they were just so good at knowing what the client's needs were. I mean, I remember I visited one of the clients, and she was telling me how Gertrude had designed it so that the flowers she brought from her garden would, she'd have a place to place them and then put her vase. I mean, everything was thought through. It was just very on point. And the same thing was said about Catherine. And so I think some of these women had to, well, they were doing it out of the love and passion they had for the field, because they wanted to create buildings that served. And so I think that they perhaps had a whole different viewpoint. A lot of the men, I mean, it was something that you did, it was something you got stature from. These women had to really claw their way, because it was, even in the 70s, I was talking to a fellow after one of the talks, and he said he went to school in Florida, and he remember his professor distinctly turning after, a woman left the room and said, well, I'm not going to graduate her. She's a woman. She'll get eaten alive out there. I can't do that to her. I mean, literally, this is in the 70s. So, I mean, it's just, I think these women had to have real belief that there was a purpose that they were serving. So I do find that there is a little bit of that poetic, carefulness in their work.
Sure. Not too many more questions, some comments. Amy Gould had the pleasure of doing the renovation design work for two of the buildings the chat was jumping around, in Patterson Park, the Jefferson Patterson Park.
Oh, yeah.
And then our next question we do have is, any evidence that these female architects hired female artisans to design decorative arts for their projects? Ooh, that's a good question. I was wondering the same.
So, I do know that, I mean, some of the work that, I do see sometimes there's furniture that they designed. I know that one of the women in the exhibit wasn't actually an architect, Hildreth Meyer. She did incredible murals, and there's like 64 buildings across the US that she impacted the whole feel of them because of the work that she did, both the floor finishes and the walls and the ceiling. And we had her in the exhibit because she was one of the few women who actually had work in Baltimore. She did the 10 Light Street, now covered up, but she did the whole mosaic floor that was there, just gorgeous. And we helped to document that. So I will say the other thing that I always found fascinating in our research is how women, as the field developed, women started to balance out having children. In the beginning, it seemed like some of the women who did have children, there were several who didn't, but who did, they were of a stature enough that they could afford carekeepers. But the later ones, as we move into the 60s and the 70s, they were, like you and I, who necessarily couldn't afford a home care person for their kids. And so how they often juggled being in the field was by having a home office, so they could also be with their children. And a lot of the work tended to be more residential, things that could be smaller projects that they could handle with just themselves or another drafts person versus a big office. But there are two women in the exhibit who had quite large offices. So they're fascinating, to very different stories, each one of them.
And Nathan has a question. Can you speak to any significant projects designed by early women architects in Baltimore City?
Yeah, no, we're working on that. That's what, I mean, we were doing this through the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, and we were shocked in the end. I mean, we had like only a 4 or 5 month window from the time we got the grant to realize we had to have an exhibit. We were like, oh boy. So we had to stop our pencils. Part of our problem is the Maryland Board of Architects actually doesn't have a checkbox for female. So there's no way, we're not able, the way we were able to get a lot of the women in this exhibit in our research was through the AIA, which kept a record of what all the women architects, who all the women architects were. So Helen in Baltimore, like I said, in 1955, when she got registered, she hijacked out of town. So we don't have the stories yet of those women. We do know the next generation, the Barbara Wilkes and the Amy Goulds and Rebecca Swanson, they who stayed and made a name and took leadership positions. It looks like it may be their story that needs to be told next, but we're still trying to find out. I mean, I think that there might have been a lot of women who worked for firms. They just didn't, if they weren't an owner of the firm, their story's just not known. You know, they're not going to be in the paper. It's very hard to find that kind of information. So that's why we ended up calling the exhibit The Early Women of Architecture in Maryland, since so much of it was in Maryland, and some of the women weren't Maryland architects. They were out-of-state architects, but did a lot of work here in Maryland. So we're still compiling, and we'll periodically, right now the AIA is in the process, or the Baltimore Architecture is in the process of updating the website so we can integrate the information on that, that exhibit site that we have here and onto the Baltimore Architecture Foundation website, and also to add more stories as we find them. That's what I got.
Sounds good. Well, if there's any other questions, Jillian's contact is on here. And thank you, Jillian. This was great. Very informative.
Yeah, this because of the women's right to vote being 100 years from this month, and this being set as the women's, it was a year of the women in Maryland. The exhibit actually got legs again and started traveling, so I was really surprised. So it's a great opportunity for those who haven't seen it yet to take a peek. And
I put that link in the chat box as well, and yeah.
And that building that it's in is incredible. It was designed by Y.A. Nolting, and it was so you could see that building too if you go to the exhibit. That was the summer home of one of the founders of Johns Hopkins, and he used to ride the Mampaw Railroad up from Hopkins to his house in Bel Air, and they had their own whistle stop. Anyway, so it had, I think, like 11 children. So it's this huge mansion, but it's really incredible to see. So it's a fun little foray if you want to get out from your little abodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much. And we hope to see you all next week for our Society's Cage and Interpretive Design Pavilion for the Black Lives Matter discussion. Thank you all and have a good weekend.